databases and formats where you find out that even with our database, every federal agency that transmits is required to direct our authorization either through an assignment, as Carl said earlier, or we do have rules in our manual that you transmit under like blanket type things. Everybody's supposed to have authority. Now again, is our database 100% correct our government master file? No, it's not. Neither is the FCC's. We try to work on that. So the bottom line is we will try to be as transparent as possible. We will never be as transparent as you want us to be. We will do the best we can to get you the information that you need. Sometimes what's shocking is we can point you to information that's out there. We do a lot of IQR work. People want to know characteristics. We never give characteristics on your radars. We don't know what's going on. Well, we do studies in the ITU. It's open to the entire world. I mean, people aren't aware of that. Again, shame on us maybe for not getting that information out. So we will do the best we can. We're here as part of the government to serve you. Again, it won't ever be everything you want. We do have security requirements and whatever. It is an agency call, not an NTIA call. But again, we're here to do what we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, Carl,
I'll just respond to one or two things very quickly because I don't want to get to questions. But first, just to clarify what I mean by the zero-based budgeting idea was not having to do with money, but having to do with the spectrum and the use of the spectrum. That is to say, agencies essentially, when they want to do something, go to the IRAG and then NTIA, fill out an application describing the basic dimensions of the system. The NTIA and the IRAG figure out how this fits in with everything that's out there and then gives a yes, no. And then that tends to remain a very static. There is a notion that for agencies that if they no longer need the allocation, they should return it so that it can go back into the pool, but there's no enforcement mechanism or anything like that. In the FCC, we have a notion of license renewals, which have essentially renewal expectation, but there is this notion that every 8 years, 10 years, whatever, the FCC will take a look and see if you're actually doing all the things that you're required to do to maintain your license, and if you don't, then in theory you lose the license. I don't think we need to go to that kind of a regular system, but there does need to be something, and I characterize this as a modest proposal, as a literary reference. Well, I'm not sure, and I'm sure that there are some federal spectrum managers who would regard this as being as bad as eating their babies. But the fact is that what is proposed here was meant to be draconian. It is not a substitute for the legislation. It is a way to say, okay, what we want to do is really rethink this. But on the flip side, we also stress that we shouldn't just abandon agencies. That part of making this work and really making this work, and therefore there would have to be federal budget dollars allocated to making this work, would be for NTIA and OMB, particularly through the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, to be a resource to help agencies so that agencies could actually take a serious look at what they're doing, to have the heads of agency that Kathleen was talking about who don't know about what spectrum is and don't care. They have bigger things that they're thinking about, and this is just an input to getting things done, to actually have a mandate with sufficient clout coming from the president to go downstairs and say, all right, what are we using, and why are we using it, and what could we be doing better around this, and then have a planning process that is modeled on the federal budget process where agencies do look at, okay, here's what we need to accomplish, here's our mission, here's the money we think it's going to take to do our mission, here's ways we think we can do what we want to do in a way that is more cost-effective, or here, frankly, is where we're going to have to ask for more money in order to be able to meet the responsibilities that we have. And that's the kind of regular thinking about and planning process for federal agencies with regard to the use of spectrum that we think is useful, so that at a very high level we can have OMB and NTIA thinking, well, okay, a lot of people have a need, a lot of agencies have a need to talk to each other, which is a problem that's been solved in a lot of different ways. If we have to buy everybody, essentially modern walkie-talkies, rather than having agencies, some of them haven't been able to afford upgrades since the 80s, and some of them, you know, have the best systems imaginable. Why don't we figure out some way to standardize this across all agencies so that we can just give agencies what they need?
Greg, any thoughts to add?
Part of the problem, I think, can be summarized by the following anecdote. It's an FCC anecdote. A couple of years ago, I was working on creating a database of VRS licenses. And I discovered using the ULS database at the FCC very quickly that more than 10% of the entries had typos in them that made it impossible to retrieve the details of the license. Almost 30% of the entries had various data entry points in the form that they never filled in. And the topic of this, as I've gone through and identified every one of these cases, was I could find nobody at the FCC who wanted to hear about it. It took a personal phone call to Kevin Martin to get someone from the data entry department to call me back. There has to be, in addition to all of the planning and all of the establishment of political incentives to bring about transparency, there also has to be a basic commitment at the lowest level within the bureaucracy to ensuring that when members of the public want information, they can access to it. And from my experience, I can say bluntly, that's not trivial.
Playing off that concept, I wanted to turn to that as the sole representative of the federal government here. Harold's and Greg's paper portrays a quote-unquote arcane spectrum management system where there are discrete assignments for every agency and there's no mechanism for tracking its use that's publicly accessible. Is that an accurate description? And to what degree can the government actually be more transparent in terms of systems that perform national security functions, law enforcement, or other missions?
A couple of things. One thing, again, Carl stole my thunder earlier in one of your questions. One of the things people think about in spectrum is cell phone type spectrum, land mobile. Again, basically we have two bands at 162 and 406, less than 30 megahertz that we use for land mobile. It gets a lot of attention internally too because every agency is involved in those bands. For most of our other bands, our radar bands and such, and it's a little bit different. I mean, for people who think they're going to get the assignment information in most cases, I don't think that's going to happen in a lot of cases. One of the things we are finding out though, and we're looking into like with some of the radars, do we have to release locations or whatever? To do geolocation or whatever. If agencies are willing, again, it's an agency call, not an NTIA call. If agencies are willing to release information, NTIA certainly has no problem because it makes our lives a lot easier. You know, having somebody call me up and saying, it can't be released, you know, and hang it up on me like, not good government service like I just heard or whatever, but that's the way it is. So if we can do that, we're more than willing to do that. From our perspective, like I said earlier, within the government, everybody who's transmitting as a federal entity either needs a GMF assignment or needs to be operating under a policy in our manual, usually Chapter 7, which allows you to do something without a specific authorization. So we have good tracking mechanisms, and we're looking at what more we can do. From the spectrum inventory stuff, we think is going to bring out some of this. We think, you know, whether it's forcing us or whether we're doing it on our own or whatever, we think we need to get more information out there. And one thing I have to admit, just like everybody else, once you pull people off to do that, it's not a simple task. Ask the FCC who took a lot of money to do that, then you're not doing your other functions. So then you're going to be yelling at us for not doing something else. But again, that's why we have managers and we have to make decisions. So I don't think our system is any more arcane. Well, arcane in the sense that nobody knows what's going on. I think that's spectrum management as a whole kind of. But I think we're very similar. People may not believe it to the FCC, except their databases are very public, maybe. But one thing I always mention to people, even they have public databases and we don't. I've been in the business 36 years. I've never seen a spectrum decision made in the FCC realm like that because everybody had all the information, had all the assignments. That just doesn't make things happen automatically. So having the information is nice. The problem is, it's just like everything else in DC, and it's kind of good. We're very rigorous here. And you may say we're slow and all this, but we're very rigorous in giving people what they need to do. And we're going to try to do better. Like I said, we're looking at improving our databases more for internal uses, because the more information you have on antenna patterns or whatever, the better you can squeeze people in. But getting all this stuff public, like I said, we will make public whatever the agency will let us make public.
One of the points that Mark was making during his presentation was that in sort of analyzing these issues from an academic perspective, he's concluded there's not a lot of waste in the government spectrum, and I'll pick on Kathleen here, who was nodding or shaking her head vigorously at that suggestion. What do you think? Is there spectrum to be harvested from the government realm?
Yes, I absolutely think there is, and part of it is a couple of thoughts on that. One is, I think the notion of the spectrum. I was on a panel yesterday, and John Peacock from the FCC said capacity and spectrum are not the same thing. And the government, you got to look at the equipment the government's buying with the spectrum that they're using. Okay? They can buy really cheap, crappy analog equipment that uses 20 megahertz of spectrum because they get the spectrum for free, right? So it's okay to use lots of spectrum, okay? That's the you got to look at both sides of that. And I think trying to encourage them to use more efficient technology is definitely something that's got to be on the table. And I think that what we saw is, like I said, I can't emphasize this enough, and I think there are, apart from the efficiencies, there are security issues. I mean, do you want FBI agents walking around with analog, surveillance, sunglasses or whatever they have, jackets that can be hacked into? That's what we're talking about. I mean, some of the law enforcement folks are walking around with 20-year-old equipment that really isn't very secure. And so there's a benefit, I think, to getting them to better technology because it's more secure, they get better operations, and it's more efficient. And they use less spectrum. We also found government agencies that said, aha, we don't really need spectrum for this use anymore. We can use fiber, we can use some other mechanism, or we can piggyback on other agencies' government uses and so forth. So a lot of that came through, frankly, transparency, shining a light on it, and then having to go back and really think hard about whether they really needed that much spectrum and so forth. So I think, that's all, good stuff, and I think a lot of it is, again, I get down to sort of time and money being thrown at it, and to some degree planning.
Carol, you have points?
Yeah, and I want to say this was exactly why we really wanted to elevate the role of NTIA and the CTO position having been created in part to try to do things like this, to raise the consciousness throughout the federal government. Because right now the situation is that, if you are whoever it is who is doing the budget for the Department of Energy or, the various divisions of the Department of Justice, you're not thinking in terms of how do I improve spectrum efficiency. What you're thinking is, I got this much that I got to get done, and I get this much money, and OMB is always telling me I got to figure out how to, drop the request down and save the money, while Congress is always telling me that I got to get more stuff done. And that is going to continue to be a reality unless there is a way to change the thinking around this. And again, agencies are never going to have uppermost in their mind, save money and be more spectrally efficient. So we have to make it as easy as possible and put into the already existing processes that the federal government has ways in which, right now, the way this is supposed to work in federal budget is you have, the Office of Management and Budget, you have the Office of Personnel Management, and all of these, and General Services Administration, where the federal government is already at a high level trying to say, well, everybody is going to need chairs, so we ought to figure out the best way for the federal government for every agency to buy chairs. Not that we make decisions on an agency-by-agency basis, but there's at least some system in place that tries to make it cost-effective. So there's a notion of, we could look at some of the common, needs among agencies. Agencies that have enforcement responsibilities need to communicate with each other. And try to say, okay, can we have a process that's going to make it as efficient as possible for these agencies to meet those needs without requiring that the person who's in charge of making sure that happens in every individual agency has to rethink this process from scratch every time and sell it to his boss, who has, frankly, a lot of other things that he cares about more.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that I think that the notion of moving to more efficient technology and better secure technology is actually an enhancement for the government. I mean, it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's a carrot, not a stick. And I think that is something that also, I think, getting the mindset around that the government. I know, Harold, in your paper you talked about sort of punishment on some level. I don't see it as punishment. I see it as, again, a carrot enhancement. Give these guys the money and the tools to actually get the better technology. Those spectrum managers deep in the agency really want that. And so getting them those tools, I think, is really important.
Well, that was, in fact, what we were trying to say was that too often this is spoken of as a punishment. It's why I hate spectrum fees. I really, really hate. I used to be a Fed, and every time I hear, like, let's have spectrum fees so that the agencies will now have an additional cost so that they'll want to minimize use of spectrum, I cringe because, that goes to that, punishment mentality. And I think we need, and I know you've supported it because that would, while it's to some degree of punishment, would also get the attention of the agencies in focusing on it. But at the same time, I do think that we need to also focus, we can talk about the specifics of spectrum fees, but I think we need to focus more on rewarding agencies and, increasing the benefit to the federal government overall as a reason for going forward on this sort of thing.
Yeah, just on the fee point, and then I'll shut up, is, think about, and I've heard Peter use this in his former life, but Toyota buys tires, and so the government buys the equipment, they don't buy the spectrum. So, I mean, again, I get down to, if there was some cost to them, they might just, in a benign way, and they might welcome that more, Harold, than sort of opening up their kimono about everything you're doing with their spectrum. They might welcome more that, oh, gee, I got a budget for spectrum now. I actually have to pay for it. Maybe I don't need so much. Maybe I need to go to more efficient equipment. I think it helps to change the mindset, and it's a tool that should be in the basket, I think, of the government spectrum managers to try to get them to think that way.
Can I just jump in on that point? In the budget crunch time right now, where every agency is looking for as much money as they can get, the idea is to suddenly increase their budget for doing the same thing that they're doing right now. Sort of unlikely. But you can take a step in that direction. One good way to sort of focus people's attention on a problem is to have them measure it. So you want to stop smoking cigarettes, so you count the number of cigarettes you're smoking, right? That sort of gets your attention. Shadow prices do a pretty good job of focusing people's attention. There could be a well-designed shadow price system that says to the agencies, here's the value of the spectrum that you're using. You know how much it is, but what's that kind of spectrum worth if it were available to the general public or for another particular use? And it's a well-designed system of shadow pricing. That would focus their attention on the value without having them needing to go to the Congress and say, now we need an extra $100 million to do what I was doing last week for free.
Well, on that point, I think whether it's shadow prices or zero-based budgeting or some other mechanism to incentivize efficient use of the spectrum, each of these methods envisions really a sea change in how we think about federal government allocations and use. Dan, to what extent is the political will there on the Hill to really rethink 50 years of spectrum policy and how the government deals with these issues?
Again, I would say that this area is more ripe for bipartisan action than other areas of public policy. Again, you have to establish the premises of generally conceded, which is that there is a spectrum crisis. That the scarcity in and of itself will push both members and the agencies to address whether or not the asset is being properly used. So I don't think we're there yet. but I think the conversation is going in the right direction, and I think that there's a general push and a general consensus among experts on it. So I'm fairly optimistic that we will address the spectrum reform in the near, from a legislative perspective, in the near future, within the next couple of years.
Do you see legislators breaking down one way or the other in terms of these approaches? Is the Democratic approach, one way, and the Republican approach another?
Not yet, no. You may see a different valuation in terms of how much we value different agency missions and how you put some sort of economic value on that mission versus what would be comparable use in the private sector. But again, I think once you have a generally agreed upon goal, then you're just talking about different strategies to reach it. If the goal is to distribute more spectrum for more uses by more people, then the question becomes how much is realistic, why, what do you value for that goal? And then you can have an honest conversation about that. I don't think it's really an ideological divide.
Trey.
Yes.
One point I'd like to make. I am very skeptical of the use of market mechanisms to provide incentives for changes in allocation of federal spectrum. In part because a considerable portion of that spectrum is used in the provision of formal public goods. And market processes notoriously fail when presented with problems around the provision of public goods. So we are likely, if going down that route, to create far more problems in the long term than will resolve.
As we're waiting for some sort of legislative change to really reconfigure or rethink how federal allocations take place, I would like to turn to Peter and ask whether your company's approach, the shared spectrum approach, this dynamic frequency agile radios with sensing technology, could, in the existing context of NTIA's administration of the spectrum, show some path forward to use the spectrum more efficiently. Is that happening today, and how can that be documented or enhanced?
Yes, in fact, this is probably the only instance in the history of mankind where regulation has been ahead of technology at both the FCC and NTIA. The FCC concluded their cognitive radio proceeding several years ago when the DARPA-XG program, which is shared spectrum, was at its formative stages before it did field testing that basically proved that it worked. And that was 2006 when we did the field testing. Since then, without, I think, any much arm twisting, NTIA on its, changed its regulations to enable systems using cognitive radio in any radio communication service, so long as they operate in accordance with the applicable restrictions governing the services. So cognitive radios are authorized under the regulations. Then begs the question is, well, what about those restrictions? What about those rules under which it operates? We can put the rule book. That's our approach. We'll put the rule book in the radio. We're in this band, we're in this area, country, whatever it is. This is the rule. But those rules are built, based on the assumption that to prevent interference, the other ones you're trying to protect are operating 24/7, 365. But that's not reality, right? So what's the next step? And we think, we'll operate under the rules on the first step. So we'll program the radios to do that. Instead of humans doing it, basically replacing humans reading the rules and programming the radios, instead putting it in software code and letting the radios operate then. And then we'll maybe even add added protections through sensing, geolocation, things like that aren't in the rules. So added protections. And we'll do it on a non-interference basis. That is, if there's interference to the other, the primary user, whatever, the protected user, we get off. So it's subservient rights in that case. So the groundwork is set, without a doubt. So there's no need right now for any major radical changes. The next step is really a cooperative approach. We'll be negotiating with the owners or the holders of the spectrum. and the secondary market on the commercial side is the perfect opportunity for that. So long as the spectrum owner is willing to, take a look at the technology, kick the tires, and say, yeah, I'm open to this sharing approach, and then it's the spectrum owner within the FCC rules, then kind of setting the rules under which the operators using DSA technology share the spectrum with each other or with the incumbent system. Say, I'm not going to plan on using this rural area because it's too expensive for me to build out, but if you guys want to do an ad hoc system to cover this concert, race car event, whatever, feel free, we'll lease it to you for this amount. Make a filing in the FCC within 24 hours, approved, bam, you're in. So that cooperative approach would be the DoD, same thing. See if you can, but Carl says you don't negotiate with DoD, you got to go to NTIA, I guess. DoD doesn't own the spectrum, despite the footnotes, the G footnotes that give it a lot of exclusivity, in a lot of the spectrum, and I think they do have a lot of power. So, can you cooperatively arrange a sharing deal with, let's say, the folks down at Yuma or Cherry Point, which right now, they can't, it's basically keep out. Even though they're not doing training, they may be brats, right? But from now until the rule change, you can't operate within 100 kilometers of Cherry Point, 1710, 1755. How about negotiable access to that with the base command? I think it's feasible now under the rules. So let the base commander establish the rules, the sharing rules with that guy. So then down the road, way down the road, we look at this so-called opportunistic kind of, I would say, forced sharing, but where the technology has proved itself, you've got, despite what the owner of the spectrum may want you to, use, whether they want you to use it or not, there'll be rules in place that says, okay, if you have these capabilities, you can operate. Very similar to the DFS type rules in 5 gigahertz, but less conservative, more flexible, things like that.
Thanks. Before I turn the mic over to Kathleen, just a call to the audience for any questions. If you'd like to forward those cards now, we do have a few minutes reserved, so please bring those forward. Kathleen?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that Peter brought up the Cherry Point example, because that's in the 1710 to 1755. There's an exclusion zone there that basically precludes all the AWS licensees from ever using spectrum in the Outer Banks of North Carolina for 3G because of the exclusion there. And so there might be some opportunity for sharing. There might be some opportunity for sharing the 1755 to the 1780 band in a similar fashion. And some of this is goes to the sort of the transparency. Let's sit down and have a dialogue. I will never forget our very first meeting with DoD. There's a very smart lady there who did all their planning, and she put a big book on the table, like this thick, like this, and she threw it down on the table and she said, "This is what we have to do to clear this band." And it's just a visual of all sorts of charts and graphs and that sort of thing. And I don't doubt that there was a lot of planning that goes into that. But the other thing that I found out about DoD, our friends at DoD, who T-Mobile has a very good relationship with, but you do have to deal with them. And one of the things I found is that they also have backup plans. They have backup plans to their backup plans, which you really hope that they do when they do. So, there were a couple of times where we sort of had some issues where something cropped up that was an unknown, and we were literally told to go do a drive-by a week later, and bingo, it's gone. I don't know where it went. I don't know what happened. I don't want to know, but they had obviously some sort of backup. So some of that, I think, is part of this process, sort of poking it a little bit and trying to reveal more transparency. Another thing, I've got tons of anecdotes about AWS, but in that first meeting with DoD, we gave them the FCC NTIA public notice that said, they're supposed to
provide information to us so we could do interference analysis about how we would share the band. And they said, we're not doing that. We don't care who put out that public notice. We're not doing that. You, T-Mobile, can provide us all your information, and we'll determine whether or not there's interference. Okay? So the very first time, so we gave them all of our cell site information. They downloaded it into a database. They spit out sort of a red light, green light, where we could actually deploy. The very first time they did this, they red lighted the entire west coast of the U.S. And part of that was they really didn't understand the technology. When we finally were able, after months and months of pressing them, to get into a meeting, get the smart engineers in the room, sort of a light bulb went off, and they said, aha, now we understand. They went in and they did the interference analysis, green-lighted the whole west coast of the U.S. So that's just an example, I think, of where transparency and discussion can actually make a huge difference, I think.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think Carol's going to kill me if I don't ask a few audience questions. So I did want to allow some time for that. Just one, I'm told. So here it is, and it's actually for you. Isn't sensing a belt and suspenders approach combined with a database scheme? How can there be a low-cost radio networking ecosystem with this approach in practice? Please distinguish between commercial and government uses.
Oh, that's a good question. Belts and suspenders, yes, that's what the TV industry asked for in the TV white spaces. Even though it's probably a little overkill. But there are sporadic uses of TV bands, including the wireless microphones, which are protected, stuff, even though there's a lot of legal uses, there's protected uses. The example that Larry mentioned this morning, which I'm glad to see put on the table, I've heard rumors about it for many years, 1675, 1710. I mean, with the government, with the balloons, you never know where they are. No database is going to help that. If you can detect and sense where balloons are transmitting, you can sense their signals, and you have protocols in place to say, if we sense at this threshold, and we'll stay off for this amount of time. Those things can be put into place fairly easily. And so it covers, fixed services like broadcast, high-power broadcast, yeah, database works, but where you don't have database, a good accurate database, like I believe exists on the government side, and definitely in foreign countries where the military has to go, that's why we have been, that's why DoD has invested so much in the spectrum sensing, and I think if you don't have a database approach feasible, I'm not sure which is going to have more cost, to tell you the truth. I mean, with private sector database providers, 9, I couldn't believe there's 9 proponents of database. That suggests to me there's some profit motive there, and the rules are pretty flexible with TV white space. And now the FCC is going to do a new proceeding. How can we expand this database approach? How about how we expand the sensing approach? Where's that? That's in there too. There's an opportunistic rulemaking. I don't like those things. This opportunistic rulemaking, by the way, that's coming from the FCC is interesting in the sense that it's basically how can we allow opportunistic, I call it, where nobody owns the spectrum, basically the other white spaces that hasn't been sold, allocated, assigned. I think on the government side, that would be a good idea too. So instead of the inventory saying where spectrum is being used, say where isn't it being used. And so it might be available on a non-interference cooperative, on a cooperative basis, whatever. So because there's no assignments there, say Alaska. Or the system that is been assigned the spectrum is still on the drawing board, or never got the allocated funds, out of the budget for that system, even though or it's still going through the spectrum supportability process, whatever. Satellite hasn't been launched. Lots of opportunities for sporadic spectrum use before when it's not being used.
Well, thank you, Peter, and I'm afraid that is going to have to be our final word. I want to thank each of the panelists for offering their insights, as well as Public Knowledge for hosting this event, and thanks to Aaron Fell and Kerry Rose for preparing the paper that initiated this great conversation. Thank you all, and